Well, I want to welcome you to this celebration of the College of Liberal Arts and to the panel, The Visibility of Gender, New Designs of Invisibilities. My name is Amy Kaminsky. I used to teach and research here at the University of Minnesota, and now I am retired. I even get to call myself emerita, which I think is very cool, makes me feel old. Well, I am. I am of the first generation of feminist scholars, trained in other disciplines, thinking around and through the women's movement of the late 1960s, early 1970s, of how we could bring our political work, our social action work, into the real world of the university. So I want to switch that around a little bit. So we were trained in other disciplines. My own was Spanish and Portuguese. Moving eventually to the University of Minnesota allowed me to do things not only around issues of gender, but within the field that other people didn't get to do because my colleagues in what was then women's studies didn't know that it was against the rules, right? So I was looking at different centuries and Spain and Latin America and dead writers and living. I mean, I was just doing stuff that I would not have been allowed to do in my own discipline. So that was one of the first things that this field did for me. So because we were trained in these other disciplines, we basically made it up, right? We kind of invented a field, and it was a very exciting and scary time. Many of us lost our jobs. I lost one, but then I landed here and had a much better one. And what's happened in this last close to half century is that there is a real there now. It is real. So let me just tell you briefly what happened to me when I came here for my job interview. What was then the Department of Women's Studies had been established here in 1973. It was called the Women's Studies Program. And not only the feminist scholars on campus, but other allies as well, thought that it would be useful not only to have feminist scholars in the individual disciplines, but to create an autonomous program. We were one of the first to do that, and we were the first women's studies major in the country. So we have a very, very long history working on issues of gender. But when I came for my interview in 1984, the dean of the college, Fred Lukerman, a nice man, some of you, asked me during my interview if I wanted to have my tenure home in women's studies or in my traditional department, which would have been Spanish and Portuguese. And I did not think twice. I said women's studies. And I was laughing because she's Spanish and Portuguese. And interestingly enough, what I found out later is that everybody who'd interviewed for the job said the same thing. Right? It didn't matter what their tradition, their old discipline was, they wanted to be in this new place. It was exciting, it was thrilling, you got to talk to people across disciplines, it was gonna be the place where stuff happened. He also asked me, okay, well, if you're in that, we put you in the women's studies program, what happens in 20 years' time when this all goes away? He did, he asked me that, and I said, I don't think it's going to go away. And he said, okay, and eventually, long story short, I got the job. So, 1970s, this new discipline is just forming, and we had this autonomous unit. And what was important about that is that we got to create our own curriculum and had more or less control over hiring our own faculty, as much as any other department in the college. And that made it possible for for a small group of people to focus entirely on this work, and for large numbers of feminist scholars in other departments to be part of the governance of women's studies. And that's what happened. Very early on, the Department of Women's Studies here focused on transnational issues, and in 1985, two of its faculty, Susan Geiger and Jacqueline Zita, published an article called White Traders, the Caveat Emptor of Women's Studies, which was a groundbreaking article addressing racism in women's studies, written by two white women who were confronted with their own kind of blindness around their race privilege and the clear race privilege that they were seeing among white students in their classrooms. So these are issues that have been around for a very, very long time. The college established the Center for Advanced Feminist Studies in 1983. This was actually an end run by the department around an administration that wouldn't let new graduate programs happen, and centers could offer graduate classes. So we created CAFs. It drew feminist researchers nationally and internationally and offered a graduate certificate. And for many people who came here in other departments, it was the center that drew them to the university. In 1998, we established the doctoral program after thinking long and hard about whether the field was sufficiently stable that the students that we brought in as PhD students could go out and find jobs in academia. So that was really what kept us from doing it for a long time. We were worried about that. Now we have to worry about it from the other end. Are there jobs in academia for anybody? But that's another story. At the same time, the department renamed itself the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, which quickly became shortened to GWIZ, making all of us really happy. That's delightful. We had really always been working on issues of gender and women and sexuality, but this was a way to name it. So, in my lifetime, scholarly attention to gender has gone from kind of a radical upstart idea to a site of analysis that really can't be ignored in any discipline that deals with human bodies and human behavior. It can't happen. It's very, very exciting to see that. The field established gender as a valid category of analysis, opening up questions like, how do differences play out in different parts of the world? How did they play out differently in different historical periods? What happens in social situations and political situations, et cetera, et cetera? You're all familiar with this. But very, very quickly, the very category became a question itself. What is gender? Is gender a thing? How is it produced? How do we live it? How stable is it? And that's really exciting. And also, of course, how it intersects with other vectors of power and privilege. So this is kind of familiar ground. So the task that was given to the panelists is to address the centrality of gender in the design of new knowledges in the academy and in communities, including the ways in which it's affected their own work. Our first speaker was to have been Aren Aizura from GWIZ. And I'm really sorry that Aren can't be here, not only because he's not feeling well and I'm worried about him, but because Aren's work focuses on queer theory, transgender studies, transnationality and immigration, as well as, or in relation to political economy and labor. And the very idea that we're now thinking in terms of queer issues and have been for quite a while, and that transgender theory is probably the most exciting thing that's going on in the field today. It's just something that we couldn't have envisioned in 1973 when we began this project here at the University of Minnesota. And I'm thrilled that the department that I worked so hard with others to build is now at a place that I couldn't have imagined at the beginning of it. So I'm sorry Aren isn't here. His title would have been, I'm sure that there's a presentation floating around there somewhere, Misrecognition, Unrecognition, Transgender's Challenge to Feminist Studies. Because challenge is what we've always been about. But our real first speaker is Njeri Githire, who is Associate Professor of African American and African Studies. Her PhD is in Comparative Literature and Women's Studies from the Pennsylvania State University, where I also have my PhD from. Her primary areas of research and teaching include African, Caribbean, and Indian Ocean cinemas, literatures, and popular cultural forms. Her book from 2014, Cannibal Rights, Eating Others in Caribbean and Indian Ocean Women's Writings, explores the prominence of alimentary-related tropes and the relationship to sexual consumption, writing, global geopolitics, economic dynamics, and migration in works by women writers from Haiti, Jamaica, Mauritius, and elsewhere. So you can see how thrillingly interdisciplinary this work is. Her current research project examines the function of food as a creative medium, and the role of food as a site for identity construction and exploration in the African cultural production. She's also working on a project that examines the place of the African immigrant story within the booming canon of contemporary American immigrant literature. She's published articles in Women in French Studies, research in African literatures, Callaloo, and the French Review, just to mention a few. And the name of her presentation is Feminism in Africa, Feminism and Africa in the Age of Gender Diversity. Welcome, Njeri. So the panelists may want to move.
Good. Thank you very much. We were invited to give Pecha Kucha talks lasting about 10 minutes. And I always really like to respect time because there are other presenters. And so I really am going to be hopefully presenting for just about 10 minutes in the hopes of then opening up discussion about what I'm presenting on. So on December 4th, 2013, the New York Times named Nigerian Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, published that summer, one of the top books of 2013. In just 2 days, the novel rose from number 3,873 on the Amazon sales rank to number 1,811. Then a little over a week later, on 13 December, Beyoncé released her surprise eponymous album, her fifth, which features 14 tracks. Track number 11 on the album is entitled Flawless. And as the beat volume lowers a couple of minutes into the song, a full paragraph of Adichie's 2012 TED Talk, "We Should All Be Feminists Can Be Hard," the Nigerian writer's message integral to the song's own. 5 days after the release of Beyoncé's album, Americana was ranked number 632 on the Amazon sales rank. And by December 23rd, the novel was ranked number 179, moving from number 3,873 to number 179 in just 3 weeks. By the time Christmas came around, the internet was rife with discussions as to whether Beyoncé could really be labeled a feminist. The name Adichie was also one of the most searched terms on Google. Over the next 3 years, Adichie became a millennial feminist icon. Her brand of unapologetically sexy and trendy feminism was perhaps best illustrated when Maria Grazia Curie, first female creative director at Christian Dior, featured Adichie for the spring and summer 2016 Paris Fashion Weeks. As models sashayed down the catwalk, wearing T-shirts that read, "We should all be feminist," tucked into intricately embroidered tulle skirts, Adichie sat in the front row, fan in hand, eyes focused intently on the runway. That same year, Adichie also became the new face of Boots No. 7 campaign by UK supply chain of cosmetics, pharmacy, and human healthcare products. Adichie's growing public and media presence generated discussions and debate around the ways in which technology facilitated a cult of personality-driven celebrity feminism, which commodified feminism as a brand, or marketplace feminism, which co-opts feminist language and ideas to sell things while doing very little to promote real change. Jessa Crispin's 2017 Why I'm Not a Feminist Manifesto, makes this kind of claims, but perhaps more readable is Andy Seisler's We Were Feminists Once, From Riot Girl to Cover Girl, The Buying and Selling of a Political Movement, also published in 2017. But Adichie's star only kept rising. Soon a heroine of the progressive left's global political agenda, Adichie was interviewed by the likes of Katie Couric, Christian Mamapour, and Anne-Marie Slaughter. She was one of the 2017 Women in the World Summit keynotes alongside Hillary Rodham Clinton, actress Scarlett Johansson, and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She also gave a keynote speech at the 2017 World Humanitarian Day event in New York. She was one of the four eminent personalities alongside Gloria Steinem, Rashida Jones, and John Meacham to write letters with love to Michelle Obama, published by the New York Times, and thanking the First Lady for the ways in which she had defined and how she had changed the world as the Obamas prepared to leave center stage from world politics. Indeed, Adichie had become global feminism's golden girl. Then on March 10, 2017, while promoting her feminist manifesto in 15 suggestions on UK's Channel 4, Adichie was asked whether it mattered how one arrived at womanhood. Were trans women women? The answer was jaw-dropping. For Adichie, trans women had lived in the world as men, enjoyed the privileges that the world accords to men before changing, switching genders in a spur of the moment sort of scenario. How then could they lay claims to the same womanhood as women born female? The intensity of the backlash triggered by these remarks forced Adichie to issue a statement clarifying her comments. But she refused to apologize. On the contrary, she cried verbiage placing and argued that the predictable public pile-on that soon followed was merely because she had departed from a language orthodoxy that would have required her to use the terms cisgendered and transgendered, yet she contended cis was not an organic part of her vocabulary. Questioned about intersectionality, Adichie dismissed the term as academic parlance and sought to distance herself from the academy with its pedantic prescriptions. It is my contention that if Adichie's public fallout became highly publicized thanks to a current media-driven and technology-intensive culture, it also illustrates the thin wedge between visibility and visibility that African gender studies have always walked. Adichie's example, in fact, attests the intense debates and fierce controversies that have dominated African women's and gender studies the last 3 decades. Central to these controversies are identity politics grounded in the location of knowledge production, the location of scholars and their scholarship, whether in Africa, Europe, or North America, tensions of race-based and sex-based exclusions, a perceived widening gap between rhetoric and reality, contentious power dynamics among scholars, activists, and policymakers have all been at the heart of what remains one of the most dynamic areas of Africanist research today, gender. A 2007 collection of essays with the provocative title, Africa After Gender? For instance, exposes but also invites critical scrutiny of the latent tensions and polarizing identity politics that underpin and further propel the study of gender in Africa and elsewhere, really. As a writer, Adichie has often affirmed that she thinks of herself as coming from a traditional literary precursors. These generations of Adichie's literary foremothers rejected the tag feminist of feminism with vehemence. Their work was decidedly feminist, but feminism was, in their mind, a Western import that endangered authentic African cultures. A notable example, acclaimed Ghanaian novelist and playwright Ama Ata-Aidoo denounced feminism as an embarrassing Western philosophy, a destroyer of homes, imported mainly from America to ruin nice African homes. For her part, renowned writer Buchi Emecheta of Nigeria espoused a more ambiguous and conciliatory stance, referring to herself as a feminist with a small f. Adichie publicly embraced feminism as a political stance, a method for analyzing hierarchy, even as her own stance has become a lightning rod for controversy. Now, the very fundamental and enduring frictions between African scholars and activists and northern white feminists and feminists of color go way beyond labels and badges, and so do the strained relations between African Americans, Africans based in the West whose research is gender in Africa, and local custodians. They always boil down to the same question: who is seen, who is heard, who is included? The nearly equal amounts of critical acclaim and controversy that surrounded Alice Walker's 1993 documentary film, Warrior Marks, resonated with the inevitable struggle for self-representation by African women on the highly vexed and sensitive question of clitoridectomy. Made in collaboration with Kenyan-born British filmmaker of South Asian descent, Pratibha Parmar, Warrior Marks sparked outrage and fierce opposition, bringing to the fore the inherent problematics of and violence inflicted in attempts to speak for others, as has Adichie's example. Similarly, the emergence of rights movement throughout Africa in the 90s and the growing numbers of African politicians and clergy pushing for legislation that defines marriage and, by implication, Africanness as exclusively heterosexual has often ignited polarizing debates among gender scholars, activists, and community partners. It is indeed fair to say that gender has become 21st century Africa's single most vital component of development-related policies. From education programs to incentives geared towards the eradication of poverty and health disparities, gender is mentioned on the streets. It is co-opted by governments, deployed by policymakers, NGOs, and foreign assistance programs. In a recent essay on the conceptions of gender in development discourse, Singh Fred underscores the transnational pressures that NGOs and foreign assistance agencies exert on the dynamics of gender activism in Africa, with specific reference to the battle over language, which too often threatens to eclipse women's realities. Alfred notes that such terms as reproductive health have little resonance and even less appeal to women for whom finding a means of livelihood and healthcare, pure and simple, is more important than winning a legal right to abortion. And so it seemed to me that after the imbroglio surrounding Adichie's ill-considered, uninformed, and flat-out wrong conclusions about trans women had subsided, it was worth stepping back to consider what the incident had to say about the ever-present interplay between visibility and invisibility in African women's and gender studies. And so that's really what I'm hoping to do today, by bringing that most recent and most publicized event into a broader discussion. Thank you.
What I thought we would do is what I thought we would do is take a little time for each of the speakers to answer some questions, and then at the end we can have a larger discussion. So, can you take your own questions?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Mary.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned Andy Zeisler's work and that whole notion of the commodification of feminism. I'm just wondering if you find that it has much value for your own work in African feminist studies.
The whole question of commodification of feminism, it really is, it's a good question. And the example of Adichie has been for me the most telling. because it's hard to really wonder what the T-shirts "We Should All Be Feminists" that are, being worn in catwalks in Europe, what that really has to do with African women's realities. They're bringing feminism and, of course, African women's issues to a broader audience, but at the same time, there's also a distance with the lived realities, and I really struggle with that. And the same question arises when I see, for instance, the recent campaigns to go and provide feminine products to girls in schools in Africa, which was a huge thing around the time that precisely Adichie was, when she had become quite a media personality. And it troubles me because on the one hand, I feel that this, who is it really benefiting? Because there are the feminist, the feminine product makers who are quite involved in this. And I look back and think that, frankly, when I was going to school, I never heard of a girl missing school because of her periods. And I don't know whether millennials' periods are different. What's going on? So I struggle with these questions because on the one hand, you cannot, the whole discussion precisely around Adichie has been very divided. There are people who feel that she's bringing important questions to the fore, that she's bringing visibility. She's talking about feminism, really, coming from a tradition of women who had denied feminism, who saw these as a Western import. Yet at the same time, there are these tensions that arise that, and I'm not sure that I can really answer that question. That's how I relate to it in my work, and always struggling and opening up my classes to hear what my students have to say, who are much more in the world, I think, more than me now, much more involved in technology. Yes.
It's kind of what my students have grappled with too when it comes to Adichie.
Right. Right.
I think we'll move on to the next speaker. We'll have plenty of time later to come back to other questions that you may be thinking about. The second speaker is Laurie Ouellette, who is professor of communication studies and professor and chair of cultural studies and comparative literature for her sins. I mean, I've been department chair. It's not the most fun in the world. She writes about feminism, popular media, and social and political theory, and is the author or editor of 7 books. She's currently working on a project on media, on precarity media. The two of her books, just so that you have a sense of what she's written, are Lifestyle TV and Keywords for Media Studies. And her presentation today is called Represent Yourself, Gender and the Contradictions of Media Visibility. Laurie.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping my PowerPoint is going to cooperate. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I am a media scholar primarily. So for me, the term gender visibility has both a particular history and a new sense of currency in the wake of webcams, reality television, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, and social media technologies. The history of gender visibility is linked to the centralized capitalist institutions of modern mass media, from magazines and cinema to radio and television, and to their enormous power to shape and define the norms, the boundaries, and the meanings of gender, race, sexuality, and class. While there were always contradictions and possibilities for resistance, for the most part, this is a history of what the sociologist Gay Tuckman famously called symbolic annihilation. The systemic absence, objectification, dehumanization, subordination, and trivialization of women and other non-dominant groups in repetitive ways that upheld patriarchy, compulsory heterosexuality, and white supremacy. Female identifying subjects were vastly underrepresented or narrowly cast in a manner that denied the complexity of their subjectivity, their humanity, and their agency. Within this context, it makes sense that the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s were deeply invested in both critiquing images of women in the media and in producing alternatives in the form of broadsheets, pamphlets, documentaries, zines, radio, and cable access programming. Well, many of the problems identified by Tuckman, Laura Mulvey, Michelle Wallace, and other early feminist media scholars are still present in US media. The Mediascape of 2018 looks a lot different than it did 50 years ago. In fact, it looks a lot different than it did when I was a graduate student in the early 1990s. Today, the politics of gender representation unfold in a highly fragmented and increasingly interactive digital media context of 500 channels, niche marketing, cell phone cameras, streaming platforms, digital tracking devices, and social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Not only do we have vastly more media content, we have more media content targeted to consumers defined by gender, race, sexual orientation, and other differences, characterized and tracked through sophisticated marketing technologies and algorithms. And at the same time, we have more opportunities to represent ourselves and to generate our own media content, from Instagram selfies to YouTube vlogs to Twitter threads. Women, queers, non-binary people, people of color, and economically disenfranchised people are no longer merely the objects of representation. Today, we are also called upon to produce images, discourse, and content, including representations of ourselves and our lives for a dramatically shifted mediascape. This unprecedented expansion of visibility through new media technologies and the modes of self-representation they afford is a theme that I've been thinking and writing about for some time now, most of my career. From the Real People talk shows of the 90s to reality entertainment in the 2000s to the rise of social media and its incitement to broadcast yourself in the parlance of YouTube, I'm fascinated by how the influx of so-called ordinary people in the media as producers as well as consumers comes to bear on decades of symbolic annihilation. I keep coming back to the question of self-representation because I'm drawn to the potentially progressive possibilities of new circuits of visibility, particularly the extent to which they facilitate processes of giving an account of oneself, in the words of Judith Butler, and the new forms of networked collectivity and solidarity they may engender. But I'm also painfully aware that the proliferation of self-representation is bound to the demands of neoliberal capitalism, including enterprising models of subjectivity and a post-Fordist business model that runs on the commodification of identity and the free labor of consumers. While the symbolic annihilation of women has unquestionably given way to more expansive forms of visibility, this doesn't mean that we control the production, circulation, or outcome of our representations. Toward that end, I wanted to spend the rest of my time sketching out 3 contradictions of gender visibility in the contemporary mediascape, and I'm going to try to be brief, and we may go back to these in the Q&A. The first contradiction is that while media culture now offers many more opportunities for real people to document and share their experiences, the scripts they're called upon to perform are often shaped by commercial imperatives and market-oriented templates of subjectivity. This is most obviously the case in reality television, where subjects are called upon to perform marketable and often highly cliched versions of themselves in exchange for media visibility and the rewards, celebrity sponsorships, future gigs, that media visibility now signifies. Likewise, on digital platforms like YouTube and Instagram, The invitation to represent yourself emerged in tandem with the circulation of neoliberal maxims of self-maximization and a model of enterprising personhood that values competitive individualism over collectivity or solidarity. Alison Hearn characterizes the mode of self-representation that dominates digital platforms as a type of self-branding, and that the individual produces her own persuasive packaging and performs gender and other social identities in ways that are ultimately geared to the generation of social and economic currency. Within this system, self-representation is motivated and valorized by ratings, likes, retweets, and followers, which in the case of social media influencers can be exchanged for endorsements, product placements, and other economic rewards. This system, in turn, often encourages the replication of dominant expectations of gender and femininity. I'm sure we can think of many examples of gendered self-branding. I had Kim Kardashian on the slide earlier. But according to Hearn and other scholars, the important point is that we are all called upon to participate in this model of self-representation in the age of social media. So the second contradiction is that while anyone with a cell phone can theoretically produce and distribute an account of themselves, this does not necessarily critique or dismantle traditional gender norms or inequalities in the way that Butler theorizes. Technologies are ambivalent, subject to the pressures of the society in which they operate. Recent feminist scholarship by Rosalind Gill and others suggests that for women and girls, the imperative to make oneself visible on social media can actually bind us more deeply to gendered forms of social regulation and technologies of the self that perpetuate dominant expectations of beauty, well-being, personal responsibility, and self-care. Beyond the expansion of surveillance and data mining, which is worthy of its own talk, social media technologies can deepen processes of self-monitoring that equate female empowerment with post-feminist notions of individual agency and personal choice. To make oneself visible, in other words, is to enter into diffuse networks of biopolitics and governmentality, even as the promised rewards of visibility reinforce the logic of self-maximization in the enterprising self. If you haven't seen these are just a few of the many, many different apps that you could use to edit and enhance your selfies. The final contradiction I want to conclude with concerns the politicized possibilities of self-representation in networked media culture, with practices of giving an account of oneself that aren't so easily folded into neoliberal and post-feminist frameworks. From hashtag feminism to Me Too, social media have also played a role in the upsurge of multiple feminist discourses, manifestos, memes, images, and slogans, and with the sharing of personal experiences understood as resistive, non-normative, collective, and political. This manifestation of visibility is very different from the call for better, more realistic, or more progressive images of women that have traditionally guided representational politics. In that sense, it speaks to Herman Gray's call to rethink our political investment in realism and representation in the current mediascape, and to think more complexly about media's role in the mobilization of sentiments and the circulation of feelings, what Sarah Ahmed calls stickiness. In an economy of visibility marked by a surplus of media imagery, Gray writes, scholars who care about social vulnerabilities based on race, gender, and other social differences should be worried less about questions of accuracy or ideology than about those moments of media culture that, quote, attract and hold us and conjure strong feelings. At their best, network circuits of self-representation can foster this stickiness as a step toward collective energy and solidarity. Unfortunately, as Sarah Benet-Weiser points out in her new book, Empowered, Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny, it isn't entirely clear that visibility of any kind can lead to structural change. Bené Weiser critiques the corporate neoliberal tenor of female empowerment discourse and questions whether the surge of feminist-themed television or opportunities to participate in positive modes of self-representation has any bearing on structural inequalities of gender, race, class, sexuality, and other differences. At the same time, she shows how the growing visibility of women and feminism across old and new media has triggered potent new forms of networked misogyny. Hashtag feminism, Me Too confessionals, and other performances of politicized self-representation are particularly vulnerable to dispersed forms of trolling, mockery, threats, and abuse. So to sum up, I would just emphasize that the place of media visibility in gender politics at this moment is far from self-evident. Expanded opportunities for self-representation disrupt the symbolic annihilation of previous decades, but they also generate new pressures and risks and enlist active subjects in the production of post-feminist and neoliberal scripts.
Thank you, Laurie.
Sure.
Questions? Or
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on participatory media? And so I'm thinking specifically of educational programs that focus, for example, on digital storytelling or other forms of media that students would create on their own. I guess, I often think that, they're often presented as a way to counter these representations and kind of work through them. But sometimes I fear that it's not enough.
That would fall under the category of the possibilities that keep me compelled about new opportunities for self-representation. I think within that particular framework, it could be possible to challenge some of the scripts that we see duplicated in so many social media discourses and images. So I think it's great. I still wonder, with scholars like Sarah Bené Weiser and Herman Gray, whether visibility and representation are agents of social change, and whether the investment in visibility and representation is something that progressives and feminists and the left in general need to rethink. If you think about this moment of gender visibility having virtually no impact on the election of a president who openly harasses women, or a Supreme Court justice who does the same, so that the relationship between representation and politics, I think, has become something that scholars are questioning and debating.
thanks. I think we'll move on, and again, please note down questions for later. Our next speaker is Edén Torres, an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and who teaches courses as well in the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies. She's affiliated with American Studies as well and continues to serve on graduate committees across the university. A specialist in Chicanx, feminist, and cultural studies, Torres focuses on the intersections of socially constructed categories, cultural production, and the political economy. Her book, Chicana Without Apology, The New Chicana Cultural Studies, is widely assigned in college classrooms across the U.S., as well as in Mexico, Spain, and Germany, and other places as well. Torres has contributed articles to many scholarly journals across disciplines and serves on the advisory board of the journal Chicano Latino Studies, the flagship publication of Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. Nominated for these awards by her students, Torres is most appreciative and proud of winning the Arthur Red Motley Award for Exemplary Teaching and the Council on Graduate Studies Outstanding Faculty Award. Her current research focuses on the socioeconomic, historical, and political dimensions of the relationship between Chicanx, Latinx people, and the U.S. justice system. The title of her presentation today is Discovering a Song Among Notes Not on the Page, Making Gender Visible. Edén?
You'll forgive me for sitting, but my age and body don't let me stand for very long at any given time. So, when I chose the title of this, of course, was long before I had any idea what I was going to talk about. And I'm maybe a closeted poet, so I thought that was a nice title, Discovering a Song Among Notes Not on the Page. And it reminded me of the way in which we get comfortable in this kind of rarefied space of the university with all of the complications and the theories, the development of theories and methods that have come along in 5 decades of departments like gender, women, and sexuality studies, the ethnic studies departments, the changes that have happened in American studies. And then when we go out into spaces that are not part of that rarefied space, in my case, courtrooms, in deportation hearings, and it feels like we have to start all over again from the very beginning, that a lot of what seems to have happened or occurred for us is actually not happening elsewhere. I think it also reflects kind of my own awareness of the centrality of gender and how that's developed over these decades. And it continues to be salient in an often surprisingly creative process. This is not to say that gender alone is more significant than other socially constructed categories in my work, only that I care deeply about how it intersects, overlaps, and simultaneously vibrates with race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, nationality, among other things. And that we can never have a true understanding of inequality on any level unless we learn to both pick out these various notes and combine them into chords of discernible memories and patterns that create songs. Such songs may be filled with melancholy, anger, pain, or longing. They may reflect the repetition of injustices long suffered or point us toward love and toward new ways of thinking and being. Some will stay with us and others pass quickly into and out of the lexicon. But the process will remain, as there are always more songs to be written. I think as my colleague mentioned, the Kavanaugh hearings, the last election, both point toward the fact that there will always be songs to be written. In thinking about the centrality of gender in my own work, which I was told was part of the panel, if not always in my everyday life, I believe in the Freirean notion of education as the practice of freedom. And part of what I've had to do and discovered that people do have to do when they teach in large research universities is to educate themselves on how to be educators. And so pedagogy, feminist pedagogy, critical pedagogy, has been a lot of the part of my life, my academic life, that in many ways remains invisible or hidden because it's not something that I go out and present at conferences on. It's something that I do for my students and for my own education about what it means to teach something like gender studies. And how can we do it more effectively? I'm not teaching math, I'm not teaching engineering, I'm not teaching biology. I'm teaching something that goes way beyond memorizing or learning certain disciplinary language or accepting methods that are presented to you. And so I have this lifelong fascination with trying to understand what that pedagogy looks like, trying to get across the message of the centrality of things like gender, race, class. I think of these three areas, both the institution I teach in, my students and teaching, and then going out into the world and trying to do things of advocacy, of activism outside the university. And how do these three things relate? One of the things I do in my class is to have students write an initial biography. And part of the reason I do that is because I want them to be more aware of their own social locations. You know, they all come in sort of as thinking of themselves as completely unique human beings and to some extent unaware of their own powers and privileges or lack thereof. And it is helpful for us to think about that as a class. And in order to do that honestly, of course, you have to try to build a place where people trust each other and where you can have these kinds of difficult conversations. I think most of my students now, unlike 20 years ago, most of the students now are surprised how even though they see difference amongst their classmates, and I'm talking about the physical act of looking, that they're surprised by how much in terms of class they're alike. And that becomes a moment of learning for them because they make assumptions based on their prior knowledge that people with certain faces, people who speak in certain ways, they make assumptions about that having to do with socioeconomic position or class as a cultural position that are not always true. And it's important for them to recognize both the sameness and the differences that exist in the classroom. Now, the institution, I think, as it both reflects the larger culture outside of it and the way that it operates, is a handy way for them to see how it's affecting their lives right now as students in the university and how decisions get made without the centrality of gender. How gender in many ways in the institution is thought of as peripheral or an add-on or something that's not, it's important to pay attention to, but it's not part of the central structure of the institution. And that affects their lives in many ways. So that becomes an opportunity for them to learn, you know, how is this bigger enterprise affecting me as a student when they don't take things like gender and race seriously, or they push it off to the margins, or something like gender becomes becomes part of this pool of diversity rhetoric that is really not about being anti-sexist, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, but is a part about, it becomes more about inclusion. Yes, we're open to inclusion, we're open to including these voices, but it's not about structurally changing a patriarchal institution. And so the students, in their learning about their history and the current condition of the institution, then can start to connect these things to larger questions, global questions, if you will. I think it's important, and I said in my book, that even those of us who are in the humanities, those of us who are analyzing and interpreting literature, that we have to become amateur economics people, if you will. We have to know what's going on in the political economy, and we have to be able to relate that to the stories that are being told. Now, the way that this relates to the court cases that I brought up earlier, I've been called on to testify in cases where women are being deported and they're trying to claim asylum around domestic abuse, around other kinds of violence that have happened to them in their home communities, and the way that that can build a case for them not being sent back. And so when I do this, in previous years, it was always uncomfortable for me because I do not believe that sexism or patriarchy is stronger or appreciably different in Latin American countries than it is in the United States. But I would have to make it sound that way in court because that is the way the court was functioning. Both the lawyers for the government and the judges understand or understood more an argument against them being sent back. I talked too long. Against them being sent back if I would couch it in those terms, that it's much worse for them there. Sexism is much worse there. And usually I would do that by pointing out the realities of the kinds of resources and the justice system itself there. And I found it quite humorous that every time I would say things like, only 2% of domestic violence cases in Mexico are prosecuted, the government lawyer would say, well, only 44% of cases in New Jersey are prosecuted. Would you call that patriarchy? Well, yes, I would. But in the outside world, they consider patriarchy a term that's kind of old-fashioned, and we've moved beyond that. And so that's what I mean about always feeling like I have to start at the beginning. I'm now with my 5th president at this university, my history of being here, and every time sexual assault cases come up, I feel like we have to start over again at the very beginning with education. I think that is mirrored by what's happened in in the U.S. political scene. So my time, I guess, is up. But I want to, I guess what I was trying to say as my central theme here is that even though we don't have to necessarily all focus in the same place, that we all have to always be aware in which the way that gender is central. And if we're going to help students understand how and why these inequalities exist, that it has to be tied to the political economy. Thank you.
Questions?
Aren, no, I want to know if you can talk a little bit more about this problem that we have, or tension between trying to help an individual case and representing the violence in Latin America as a stereotype, and then representing gender like in such a different way, and reinforcing the idea that feminism comes from the north, and I don't want an answer to that, but I do want to know how do you do to deal with that, because I know it's a big issue.
It's a delicate balance. I mean, it's a tightrope that I walk every time I go into the courtroom, because in some ways I have to speak to what I know has salience in that courtroom and with the kinds of arguments that I need to make against government lawyers. And it's not necessarily the kind of scholarship I would produce, because I think of gender as a global issue. I don't think of it, I don't spend time thinking, oh, it's worse here, it's better there, or, I did spend time in my early career, I think, trying to get away from the stereotypes that are there about machismo and that sort of thing. And the other thing I also understand in the courtroom is that there has been a definite shift since the Trump administration in these deportation hearings, a definite shift. The claiming asylum because of the kinds of domestic abuse that they've suffered was a way in which they could stay here. And now it's almost like someone switched off a light switch and it doesn't matter anymore. They're comfortable, and often in these cases they send female lawyers from the government, and it's almost as if it doesn't matter what's going to happen to these women when they go back. Like they're just interested in sending them back. And that's really hard to deal with. And that's why they kind of switched strategies to questioning the expert witnesses instead of questioning whether or not these people are going to face harm when they go back. So they might spend a half an hour questioning the person themselves, and they'll spend 2 days questioning my credentials on what I know or don't know. And of course, they always make the claim that gender, women, and sexuality studies is a social science field, and I haven't done the proper field work to collect the data, and so that's why I'm not an expert anymore. So an interdisciplinary field like the one I'm in, and in my Chicano studies work, similar, interdisciplinary, where I'm trying to tell why things happen and how they happen, is not kind of good enough proof of my expertise. So understanding the culture and understanding the centrality of gender globally is not considered expertise.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Mary Vavrus, who is an associate professor in the Communication Studies Department and has affiliations with Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature. She teaches and does research in the areas of feminist media studies, political economy, and media militarism. She recently completed a book that draws from all of these areas, Post-Feminist War, Women and the Media Military Industrial Complex, which is coming out in 2 months. Her presentation title is Illuminating Gender Constructions in War Media. Mary?
Laurie, may I move your laptop? Oh, that's okay. Well, like Laurie, I'm a media studies teacher and researcher. And so what I'm doing today is a case study of media visibility, which I hope will show up momentarily. Yay. Illuminating gender constructions in war media. And I want to say first, though, that when I say war media, these are media representations that aren't necessarily media or war focused, but a lot of times they're news reports on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan especially. So it was almost as if the co-host of NPR's program, The Politics Show, Scott Detrow, knew I was preparing for this talk when, on September 22nd, in a discussion of the many women military veterans running for political office this year, he asserted that Top Gun graphic is good optics. Detrow was referring specifically to Amy Mcgrath, who's the woman in the slide here. She's a retired Marine lieutenant colonel and a Democrat who's vying for a seat in the Kentucky 6th Congressional District. After mentioning Mcgrath, Detro and the other two hosts moved to discuss some of the other women who are running for office this year, the, women veterans who are running for office. They're all former fighter pilots, such as Martha McSally, who's running for Senate in Arizona, and Mikey Sherrill, who's running for a House seat in New Jersey's 11th Congressional District. Under the heading, Why I'm Running for Congress, on her campaign homepage, Sherrill describes herself as, quote, a former Navy helicopter fighter pilot, former federal prosecutor, and a mother of 4. I have spent my entire life serving our country. Sherrill and many other women veterans running for office this year signal that their military careers are primary in what makes them qualified to be legislators. And I want to follow up Scott Detro's assertion and ask why a Top Gun or a Full Metal Jacket or any other kind of militaristic graphic would be good optics in this context and at this historical moment. What makes these graphics work in a positive way for women political candidates? My answer to that question, which is also the argument for my talk today, is that Amy Mcgrath, Mikey Sherrill, and the others are beneficiaries of 17 years worth of media discourses about military women specifically that make some aspects of their lives and stories quite visible as they simultaneously cloak other aspects of their service in virtual invisibility. What emerges clearly in media representations of military women over the course of the 21st century, which is the subject of the book I've just written, is their strength, heroism, and sacrifice, all those qualities traditionally associated with service men. Documentary, hybrid, and news discourses have worked together since September 11, 2001, as a regime of media representation, affirming women's martial competency, and in the process, implicitly and explicitly legitimating U.S. war-making and military policy. So this is a very small sampling of some of the many books and films that have appeared since 9/11 that feature military women. It's large enough in quantity and similar enough in content to qualify as a media niche. Much of what constitutes this niche rests on constructions of women as competent martial subjects who serve in a military with pretty good gender politics, but which are getting better all the time because of women's presence in the military. As I've argued recently in the Gender Policy Report, casting military women in this way allows media producers to invoke an us versus them trope that has been used to justify U.S. military interventions for a very long time. That is, civilians can rationalize warfare more easily if it brings, among other things, modern views on women to regions of the world where women are oppressed, as if women aren't oppressed here. I make sense of these patterns of media visibility and invisibility by drawing from Judith Butler's notions of recognizability and grievability. Grievability is an acknowledgement that the loss of a life matters, that someone will be grieved if they die. Without grievability, Butler explains, there is no life, or rather, there's something living that is other than life. Once we have awareness that a life is grievable, that life can be understood as recognizable. That is, its precariousness or mutual dependency is on full display and can therefore be acknowledged as such. Butler insists that when we ask for this type of recognition from someone else, an other, we're not asking to be recognized for who we are, but instead for who we have become as a result of an encounter. Recognizability, Butler argues, quote, is to solicit a becoming, to instigate a transformation, to petition the future always in relation to the other, end quote. My research on media depictions of military women shows that elements that are manifest, as well as those that are absent, work to transform civilian women into grievable and recognizable martial subjects. But these subjects are not benign. I argue that because media audiences can sympathize and even empathize with them, these constructions of women warriors play a role in naturalizing militarism and normalizing war. So I want to go through a few examples of visibility, themes of visibility in this massive discourse. One of the things that's visible in recognizing women as warriors is that typically they feature multi-ethnic, multiracial groups of women. Here they're pictured in their uniforms, and this is a photo spread from the March 2017 issue of Vogue magazine. The Vogue spread is a good example of the transformation definitive of recognizability. A magazine known for being a fashion publication whose pages typically feature models draped in the latest clothing and accessories who appear as pinnacles of human achievement, shifts gears to feature military women in that same role. It's telling, I think, that the photographer, Jackie Nickerson, sees these pictures as playing a role in empowering women, an important piece of a transformation into recognizability. Other parts of the warrior women niche feature women engaged in combat training, some becoming members of the first Women Too Club. The span of time that I drew media representations from was between September 11, 2001 and early 2017, a period during which the combat exclusion policy for women was eliminated. Therefore, there were a lot of these first Women Too style of narratives. The women on the left-hand side of the screen here are the first women to finish Army Ranger training, a notoriously grueling course that only about 40% of men complete. Deborah Mesa, whose pictures are on the right side, is shown going through and being monitored in combat training as part of an Army policy change that would require all combat troops, regardless of gender, to qualify for combat-related positions. Mesa's comment about soldiers not being defined by gender is echoed throughout the many media representations I reviewed for this book. Her comment reflects the work these representations do to attenuate gender difference and effect the transformation to recognizability. Another prominent theme in this niche features military women accompanied by repeated invocations of the phrase, fighting and dying. I'm showing it as a compound term because that's how it's invoked across television news reports. Cynthia Enlow points out that the phrase women and children as a compound term has been used throughout history to justify women being to justify war making. I would note that women fighting and dying in combat works similarly to justify women being included officially in combat arms and being recognized for fighting and dying in the wars to which they've been deployed. Finally, the warrior women media niche attempts to recruit women into military service by recognizing them as effective warriors. I'm going to show you a very short video here. It's a Marines recruiting ad, and it's the first one to ever feature a woman. But what I want to emphasize is even though this was created specifically as a recruiting ad, it shares a lot of traits with the non-recruiting media that I looked at as well. Is that working? No. There we go. Can you make that louder? Can I make it louder?
I think the sound's going through the system is turned off. So it's not going to work.
Oh, bummer. Well, I hope that even without the sound, you could pick up on some of the themes there. But when the ad was released, there was really a ton of outrage about it. It prompted the Marine Corps to issue the following response on YouTube. Fans, this is not social justice warrior stuff, just warrior stuff. The Marine captain protagonist of the film is not being portrayed as an infantry officer. She's being portrayed as a logistics officer, which she is. She's portrayed reacting under fire like all Marines are trained to do, which she's done in real life in a real firefight. Her story, service, and dedication to our country is no less than any of yours because she happens to be a woman. We are recruiting those who share our fighting spirit and who also meet our higher than ever standards and requirements. If that doesn't describe you, then you can probably find better ways to spend your time instead of posting comments on a recruiting specific social media page. If you're a veteran, thank you for your service. So, although it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, you can sense the defensiveness in the response here, something that I think is worth noting because it provides insights into commitments by the military into having warrior women. Okay. That's not what I wanted there. So I'm going to wrap up with this final slide by talking about what is invisible in this particular pattern of visibility and invisibility. These things that I've talked about are among the prevalent visible parts of the warrior woman media niche. What is mainly invisible in this regime of representation is much serious acknowledgement of the misogyny and sexual violence military women are likely to encounter while serving in the armed forces, as well as recognition of the consequences of warfare on the populations in countries the U.S. has invaded. These are important omissions because they gloss over the many problems associated with war, the military, and militarism in general. And in so doing, they help to advance an ideology I call martial post-feminism, which we would be wise to be alert to as it puts a positive spin on war. And I would just note, too, finally, that the newest report on sexual violence in the military was released earlier this year in April, and it shows an almost 10% increase in the number of reports of sexual violence and sexual assault in the military. So that would bring it up to about 7,000 different troops who have been sexually assaulted as part of their military service. Which is something that very little media really talk about, save this documentary, The Invisible War, which some of you may have seen already. Thank you.
Questions? Comments?
Just a very practical one. I wasn't able to hear that recruitment video, but you heard me many times. Can you tell us what
Yeah,
you said?
it has a sort of macho male voiceover talking about how some people have it and some people don't. So it shows the Marine as a little girl who's stopping a fight, and she goes through her life proving that she's very tough, and she chooses challenges, even when the challenge is a homeless, serving homeless people in the end. Yes, throughout the time. It's not just, your average male voice. It's really that sort of tough, the kind we hear right now a lot in political ads, that voice. That's the voice.
I'm just wondering if there's a correlation to be made between, studies that show that sexual assault actually goes up the more visible that women become in an organization, and that the more kind of masculine defined roles they take on, that the incidence of sexual assault actually go up at that point.
The studies of the military and sexual violence in the military I've seen locate the problem even earlier, which is with training. So one of the things that an increase of women has made clear is that the songs and the rituals that go into boot camp training and all kinds of different specialty trainings is extremely misogynist. It really does. It creates this oppositional view. So you don't want to be a female. You don't want to be associated with anything feminine. And they locate that kind of training as a big part of the problem, so that it justifies and rationalizes dehumanizing women and attacking women even. It rationalizes violence. I mean, there's so much disgusting violence in the songs that are sung to marches and things like that. Just, kind of stomach churning. It was a really interesting study that was done about the Air Force Academy by a woman who was a student in the Air Force Academy and a sexual violence researcher, and they looked at the different ways in which life at the Air Force Academy, from everyday kind of banal things to more spectacular training rituals, help to rationalize and justify all kinds of violence against anything associated with female.
Thanks. I think what we'll do is ask the panel to come back to the front and open this up to a general discussion. Questions, ideas, your own thoughts about how gender's affected your research as a researcher, as a student, your life in the world. And I think I'd like to start by just saying to the panel, first thanking the panelists very much. I thought each of these presentations in and of, each of them by themselves were spectacular. And the way they weave in and out of each other is also fascinating. But one of the questions that comes to mind is the groundedness of this work, both in an intellectual tradition and in an everyday reality that has an effect in the world. And so I'd like you to maybe reflect on that for just a minute, each of you, if you wouldn't mind, and then others might want to do that as well. Yes, the ways in the ways in which your work is both grounded in an intellectual tradition and connects to social realities and political necessities that we're faced with today. Anybody want to start? It's a little question. It's just a little question.
So my work is rooted in media theory and feminist theory and social theory, as well as a kind of historiography of how media have developed, particularly in the United States. But clearly it's much more than a history or theory. It's about what my students are doing there with Snapchat. And it's about the long kind of standing series of questions about the role of representation in social and political struggle. So I always see those things as connected, and I'm particularly interested in how, as media have changed so dramatically in the past 20 years, what opens up or what shuts down in terms of those social and political possibilities.
I think I'm always faced with this tension between what I'm doing academically or intellectually and what the actual experience of both my students and then the people for whom I'm advocating on any given day. Since Trump got elected, I've had 3 students disappear from my classrooms. One very recently, this was his last semester, his last class before he graduated. And that's a very hard thing to deal with. And there's really not much that the structure of the university can do in those cases. This is a reality that is happening, and it's happening on this campus. And while students need to be aware of it, there's also a way in which it is invisible and stays underground. And that as a professor, you know, there's only so much I can do with that. But it's part of our reality, and it becomes part of the work maybe that I will produce. I think some of that, as I was talking about with the court cases, has changed the sort of direction of the work that I'll do in the future.
Thank you. Excuse me. My work is rooted in African studies and also in gender studies, but primarily in African studies and the need to produce African-centered knowledge, ways of knowing Africa, really to think about the ways in which the humanities in African studies do play a political role. We know that writers, and I don't know how many of you know any African writers, but African writers, whether we're talking about Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who were primarily male writers writing in the 60s, were very engaged in changing the ways in which Africa was represented to the world, but also what was happening at home. Yet at the same time, they produced a very patriarchal vision of the nation, for instance, and how African women writers then felt the need to insert their voices in the 70s and the 80s. So that is the specific grounding of my work. And I definitely do struggle with the tensions of representing Africa outside of Africa, because I'm talking about a space where there are definitely a lot of issues that would call for my intervention, yet I'm outside of that particular space. How am I rooted, how am I engaged in the communities that I represent here? And that is a question, that's a struggle that has been going on. I want to salute my sister who is sitting at the very end there, who came to visit me. In the last several years, she lives in the Netherlands. In the last several years, we lost our mother 2 months ago, but she was ill for a long time, and we went back often when she was ill. And now we are thinking, how do we actually do something about the community with the resources that, for instance, she has left us? What are we going to do with these resources? And how do we actually have them serve the community? And so that, for me, is a tension. The fact that there's an intellectual tradition that I think has allowed me to understand a lot of things about myself as an African woman, but at the same time, how is it rooted in the specific location that I purport to represent?
As my presentation probably suggested to you, my work is kind of grounded in a kind of dialectic, I would say, between the events of the world around us and this notion of gender justice that I like to think informs my work, which is a project of doing intersectional feminist scholarship that examines how the category of gender itself is politically constructed and to whose advantage particular constructions of gender work, right, and to whose disadvantage too. So looking right now at the way that these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and secret wars elsewhere around the world are going on with, U.S. troops, I just imagine that a lot of how the wars are being fought and who's fighting in those wars is very much legitimated and facilitated by certain media representations, and not just the media representations. The part that I didn't talk about today was the political economy piece of media. So much of the different media organizations that produce the bulk of war-related media are tied with financial ties and strategic alliances to different military organizations. And the Pentagon itself has an extremely extensive, well-developed entertainment liaison office that does a whole lot of work developing projects as well as approving and disapproving scripts that we see. And all of that works to help shape public opinion. And so I'm really interested in trying to get at those relationships and illuminate them and try to understand where they're at work so that we can all be more aware of how this very extensive, very sophisticated public relations apparatus is affecting our views on military interventions, war, and militarism more generally. So it's kind of become a really depressing obsession, actually, right now. I wouldn't advise anybody take it up if you haven't already.
Thank you all. Questions or comments from people in the audience? Thank you. Please introduce yourselves as you speak.
Thank you. I'm Dia Larasati. I'm from Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. Really appreciate for today's presentation, and I'm not sure I will be able to form a proper question that in response this very great craft in thinking about what we are facing today. But I would like to make connection between, I apologize, I don't know your name. I missed it. Yes, I know who you are, but I just forgot your name. And the last presentation. I want to engage with the idea of neoliberal inclusion and the idea of visibility, while at the same time as a very refined craft of erasure. Especially, let's say, in your example, I think something, the title about housewife, you screen both example, the white housewife and the black housewife, right? Both refined in the line of representation as a form of neoliberal inclusion, but at the same time, I was thinking also how then the detachment to that particular identity that being included erase the violence itself that relates with certain kind of identity that being left out. And this is precisely talking about in the military world, it's presented in refined, but it's also the visibility is very clear, it's very visible, the agenda. So I want to make connection in this one, how then we looking at this seem indirect connection, but at the same time actually resulting to most clear a map, a pattern of that mode of exclusionary in itself. I hope I make sense, but that is what come to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie, would you like to respond a little to that?
Sure. So I'm just thinking the violence of exclusion, I think, is part of what the modes of self-representation I'm interested in don't seem to allow for. So within a commercial media environment, diversity itself becomes a script, a performance. The violences that underwrite neoliberalism, that underwrite everyday life under neoliberalism, rarely have a place on Instagram or reality television or YouTube blogs, right? And so with all of this visibility, which includes an incredible amount of racial and ethnic diversity, we see an erasure of neoliberalism's historical impact. And I think that has to do with the contradictions that I was trying to tease out. The way in which more visibility, more representation, more seeming control over representations does not seem to have opened up opportunities for giving an account of oneself and one's life in a complex way, or having a critical voice. That's not to say that doesn't happen, but it certainly isn't the what we're seeing in the vast majority of new media representations.
Thank you. Others? Anna.
No, I wanted to go back to the self-representation too, and not only as a form that perhaps represents like neoliberal forms of visibility and invisibility, but also, I mean, the progressive and revolutionary ideas that self-representation was going to bring the secret, of the real thing there. And so, and my question in relation to feminism is, how much of that, see what you thought about it, is also the expectations that we have as scholars about what does it mean to be visible in a feminist way, and however you define that. And when we are confronting those images, and if in a way post-feminism did not start to give us some of the clues about some generational gaps or an abyss between different forms of approaching feminism or claiming different things.
So one of the things that I mentioned in the talk is how the various feminist movements of the 60s and 70s were extremely interested in media criticism, but also very active in media production. And looking back, particularly at feminist documentary and writings about the process of making those films, what comes up is that visibility for its own sake was not the goal. The goal was the kind of collaborative process and the kind of social outcomes of making the films with communities, with subjects. And so that's a very different idea than if we only had more visibility, we as a group would be empowered. And to get to the post-feminism part, what that did is individualize gendered forms of agency so that the kind of collective processes are devalued, and neoliberalism works kind of in the same way. So I think that's why so much self-representation now is about curating a self and a lifestyle within a certain system of rewards. It's very performative, right? It's not a question of is it real or isn't. It's absolutely performative and curated, but it does a certain kind of work, and the work is to value a certain personhood and to link agency to an individual presentation of the self, as opposed to what earlier activists might have imagined as the outcome of making a documentary with a neighborhood or a community.
Can you pass the mic down, because I could see in everybody's face an answer to this question, or a response, or did I just put you all on the spot?
Like, okay, I can talk about that a little bit, because I was talking about this Marshall post-feminism that I was examining in the book. And it's similar to what Laurie's talking about, but what makes it maybe more deadly is that it is used to getting back to your question, it's used to paper over the fact that these warrior women are being trained to kill, and so Amy Mcgrath's campaign video that I took that screenshot from is talking about how she became interested in politics because she was interested in becoming a fighter pilot from the time she was a little girl. And all these politicians kept telling her, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, women aren't allowed to do that. And then she persisted, and she became a fighter pilot just at the moment when the combat fighter pilot exclusion policy had been eliminated. But what she's talking about is what makes her qualified to be a legislator, but what she's not talking about, what none of these representations talk about, is the reality of what they're being trained to do, right? And so to be a successful warrior, you have to go into combat. And if you're going into combat, there's a good chance, if you survive, that you will have killed or injured others. And so it's a recognition that women have made all these gains because of feminism in the military, while really using feminism in a way that has kind of morbid outcomes that are definitely cloaked in invisibility. So I find that to be a pretty disturbing combination of feminist politics with militarism. Please.
I think what I'd like to add here is actually in watching, particularly Laurie's presentation, I was actually thinking intersectionality. That is, I talked about one of the criticisms that has been aired against Adichie really has been her, the commercialization of her message, for instance, we should all be feminists, and particularly I mentioned a book by Andy Seisler, which is "We Were Feminists Once: From Riot Girl to Cover Girl," and so one of the reviewers who responded to the book was asking, "Why is it that I understand Andy Seisler criticizing the fact that these the feminist marketplace that she's criticizing has become individualized, right? I can buy this, I can do this, look at me, as opposed to this being a collective, enterprise, that we were trying to achieve a collective political project. But one of the critics was asking, why is it that when we look at such shows as Blackish, that African Americans, that are bringing African Americans to the media. When we look at visibility of African Americans, we don't ask these questions. We see that it is definitely empowering for us to see more African Americans in the media. And why is it that we are saying that there's a problem with gender? So, and actually, for me, I thought, in fact, I do see the same questions. Even when you talk about African Americans in the media, they follow a particular profile. That why is it that we see that Halle Berry has become much more, much more famous than, say, Angela Bassett? She represents a certain African American, a light-skinned African American. I was looking at even the Real Housewives of New Jersey, and I said, well, it's almost difficult for me to see the difference between the two, the Real Housewives of New York and the Real Housewives of Atlanta. Atlanta it was, because they have taken on this very, the hair, right, where the hair really becomes much more like white hair, right? And therefore, again, in order to be visible in media, you have to be more like the dominant image. And so that is the connection that I was able to make, in fact, as you were having this discussion of, in fact, looking beyond the gender and actually even looking at, for me, the work that interests me, the intersectionality of it.
No, yes, I totally agree with that. What I meant was that, I mean, when you think about those collective self-representations of the 60s or 70s, they are also stereotypical, many of them. I mean, that very idea of that, because you are Latino, Latin American, you're going to be collective. And that's why I was talking about outward expectations. And the reason why I'm asking this is, I mean, in Argentina right now, everything is being moved by a group, group of women that are doing like a big movement, not similar to Me Too. It's about, it started as against violence against women, but most of the participants that are spending the nights in front of the Congress to pass an abortion law are very young women who take selfies, like selfies, and do all the media, and they are having a political participation and a collective and a sense of solidarity that perhaps is invisible there, but if it's there. So that was my question about the expectations. Now, I mean, what is the visible after all is going to bring us? In my own work with film, at one point I just gave up and I started analyzing sound. And actually, the voice gave me some of the clues that the images were not giving me. So I was more pointing, I understand, no, the individualistic type of representation, but I was talking more about our expectations of the visible, and how the visible can be, and the dialogue that we establish with that.
I'm taking that as a clarification, and I'm not sure that people have a response to it, but they might.
I don't know. Again, I answer the question. So, talking about expectations, and again, I come back to what I presented on, because that gives me the template to be able to think about the question you're asking. And again, talking about, when I think of Adichie, her visibility, again, that she's been very visible. When I read some of the responses that her TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists, had garnered, and often from blogs by scholars, African scholars in America, African male scholars, I really was taken aback, because I felt like we do need to have this conversation, because I'm just surprised by how much patriarchy is coming out, just how sexist the language that they are using to respond to her is. And so for that reason, I say that, yes, I think it's a good thing that we're having that discussion. Yet at the same time, as a critic, I can't stop there. That it's a good thing we're having this discussion, but beyond that, what is it that we're hoping to achieve? And so I think that expectations, yes, the talk, her visibility has prompted a discussion, but we can't stop there, because there are the other tensions. And I think as a scholar, those tensions always exist. And so it's consistently talking about, well, expectations are, yes, her TED Talk has achieved something, but at the same time, what is left behind is the theme of a panel, right? Visibility and invisibility. That I think is my take.
I think in a way you're asking about the relationship between culture and structure. And what's fascinating to me is how, after many decades of critique of images of women in media, we're at a point where we have lots of images, we have lots of ways to make our own images, and our political culture is incredibly regressive and hostile toward women. And so I think that the idea from the 60s and 70s that if we can change the images, the political structure will change, I think that scholars are beginning to question that and to think more complexly about the relationship between representation and socio-political change. Also, visibility can make a person vulnerable to, profiling, to marketing, to all sorts of, monitoring and enlistment and kind of technologies of the self. So maybe visibility is not a good thing.
I think it's a good thing, and I think it's a first step, and it's often a way of getting students to be aware of the prior knowledge that they bring into the classroom. But yes, they need to be pushed beyond that. And you need to figure out a way to use their prior knowledge to start helping them make links to something that is actually new. So I love this idea of seeing these ads, like this representation of feminism, military. Well, for me, if it was really feminist, they wouldn't be in the military to begin with. And, you know, why does that keep being recreated? And why is it so easy to pull in feminism as an excuse to do that? You know, that's where I want my students to go beyond the deconstruction to trying to think about how are we actually going to not put women in these positions of reifying a certain kind of masculinity, you know, which including them in the military, in these military images, but to actually to go beyond just deconstructing the fact that it's occurring. What do we imagine in the place of that? What is invisible? What are we not seeing from our current positions? What are we not seeing? And trying to push that way of thinking into a more creative process that hasn't happened yet. We're doing it every day, but it hasn't quite happened yet.
Hi, I'm Beth Mercer-Taylor, and I am a coordinator for sustainability education, or the sustainability studies minor here at the U, which is actually a 5-college program. So if you're a faculty member interested in sustainability, this program belongs to you. So I'm glad to meet you on this occasion. But as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the profession that I find myself to be a part of, which is about 70–80% women, and I understand trans identities are complex, but people who present as women. And the profession sort of exists of coordinating academic sustainability programs and sustainability programs on campuses maybe for 10 or 15 years, so it's fairly new. And with articles like there's 14 years left to save the climate coming out in the New York Times 2 days ago, the level of kind of urgency and commitments in this space is growing. And I just came back from the National Conference for Sustainability in Higher Education about a week ago, and I've found increasing discussions about what is going on with all the women, particularly white women, who are in these spaces of coordinating sustainability. There's a lot of discussion about intersectional issues and environmental justice and systems change versus individual change. And then kind of overlaying that, another narrative about this change that needs to happen isn't operating at the right level. And really, the crux for the work should be happening a little higher than you folks or us folks. And it's interesting to sit in that conversation and think about military narratives and being in a role that's basically coordinating, shepherding students, dealing with the grief that they have. I've seen that a lot over the whole suite of intersecting issues that challenge them and our planet and all of our relatives on the planet. And it can be, you know, hard and quiet work. And even, you know, just today, actually, I've been seeing from, I'm in a very, I realize, safe, maybe, internet space, because a lot of others doing this work are talking about mental health and their own mental health and that of their students, and just the challenge of this type of intersecting work and all the things that are sort of going wrong and how to, you know, stay hopeful. And it's really opposed to this militaristic narrative, and then it's sort of being taken over by solutions and scaling up. And I look up at the places higher than that and I see a lot of white male faces. So it's just interesting.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Any last words from the panel? Well then, thank you all very much for being here, and thank you very much for an extraordinarily enlightening, exciting group of presentations.